Welcome back to the reading of God's Word. And now we're in the third video of this week, and we are in 2 Kings chapters 9 through 16. We've moved now through basically the heart of the divided kingdom kings. We're coming to the last end of that. It's not all the way over with. There's still more to go even after this week. But we continue as we read. Now this gets very busy, very busy. And for example, here, as we begin in chapters 9 and 10, we see a lot of this is sort of difficult to follow, and it is very busy. In other words, here we see in 9 and 10, we see Ahaziah is king in Judah, Jehoram is king in Israel. Jehu is anointed to be king in Israel by the direction of Elijah. Jehu kills Joram. Jehu has Jezebel killed. In chapters 10, verse 11, the 70 sons of Ahab are killed. In verse 28, Jehu eradicates the Baals from Israel because he is basically trying to do the right thing as Elisha has anointed him to do that, to try and straighten that out. But we see in verse 29 that Jehu left the golden calves in Bethel and Dan that was put there by Jehoram, who was Jeroboam, who was against Rehoboam, at the very beginning then of the divided kingdom. So it's still in place. A lot. There's so much that's happening here as we move through it. And also in chapter 11, as we read of Athaliah. Athaliah is the mother of Ahaziah, and she's a pretty devious girl herself. As she has basically the children of Ahaziah murdered, and she takes over as the queen in Judah. And finally, she gets her just due as Joash, who was her grandson, finally becomes king. You'll read where he was sort of protected from her, and then he grows up a little. He's still a kid, but he in turn has Athaliah, his grandmother, killed. So and he takes over as the king, and he basically does the right things. He turns out to be a pretty good king. And what he does, if we go to chapter 12, what he does then is appropriates the fund to have the temple repaired and restored from the damages of the previous kings and the priest and the false priests, the false individuals that were Baal worshipers, because a lot of Baal idols were put into the temple. So he tries to get all of that straightened out and does a pretty good job of it, but it will not last. And then finally, we look into chapters 13 through 16. And what we see here is basically tracing a few more of the kings, mostly in Israel, the northern kingdom, as we move towards the end of that kingdom. Still very, very busy. And we're going to see that, as we talked about in the very first video for this week, was watch the decline of both kingdoms. Here now we're coming towards the very end of the northern kingdom. You will see that in chapter 17 as we begin next week. And they will fall to Assyria in 722. So it's kind of interesting to see that the divided kingdom, which began with Rehoboam in Judah and Jeroboam in Israel after Solomon, which was around 931 BC, and it would continue until 722 BC with Israel's exile into Assyria. And that would be around 220 years then of the divided kingdom. And then remember too that just for information, you know, the first three kings were the united kingdom, and that was Saul and David and Solomon. So each of those reigned 40 years for 120 years total there. So we've had 120 years of the United Kingdom. Then we have up to chapter 17 will be 220 years of the divided kingdom. Then the divided kingdom would come to an end because there won't be a northern kingdom anymore. There will just be Judah left. And Judah will hold on and survive until about 589. Actually, the beginning of that Judah's fall would be in 605. That would be when Daniel was taken to Babylon. But in 589 was the official fall of Jerusalem and being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So there is a lot of prophets that went with that. A lot of this was talked about by Isaiah and Jeremiah. Isaiah prophesied against Judah for the longest time, and Jeremiah actually lives through it. So they're very active as far as the last days of Judah is concerned. So with all of that and with all this reading, and I know that we won't quite get to the end of the divided kingdom in this reading this week, but we will next week. And so I ask that you pray that God gives you the insight and understanding as you read through this very difficult time in Israel, and that He gives you that the insight there that you understand the decline of rejecting God, and finally God's judgment comes to them through the exiles. So with that, may God bless the reading of His word.